laws made no allowance for audience, the censors routinely distinguished between books of mass appeal and books of minority appeal, applying more rigorous standards to books of mass appeal. I was treated indulgently because only a tiny segment of the population would read me. Implicit in this approach is an understanding of how books affect the course of human affairs, an understanding which happens to strike me as quite wrong, quite mistaken. The books that change history are not necessarily bought hot off the press and devoured by the masses, who at once fall under their influence and are galvanized into political action. The processes of history are much more indirect than that and take much more time. But that is the subject of another lecture. To conclude our proceedings tonight, I want to return to the passage that I read to you earlier from Waiting for the Barbarians. The passage that was not singled out for query by the relevant censor. The passage in which the colonel in the security police explains exactly how torture is used to extract the truth from prisoners. Colonel Joel, in the book, is the leader of a special unit within the police that moves from one trouble spot in the empire to another, interrogating prisoners and putting together a picture of how resistance to the regime is being planned and organized. His attitude toward the local law enforcement authorities, represented in the book by the magistrate, is one of disdain. The local police, he in effect says, don't know what they are doing. It takes a specialist from headquarters like himself to do the job properly. Now, the South African press, or at least the liberal press, after the escalation of resistance to apartheid in 1976, was full of horror stories about the treatment of political prisoners. Though limited in what they were allowed to report by legislation that effectively gagged the extra-parliamentary opposition and made denigration of the police a crime, the way that reports were written made it clear to any discerning newspaper reader that torture of prisoners took place routinely, and that within the so-called special branch of the police, there were specialists in torture who came to be well known by prisoners and dreaded by them. Prisoners died in custody at their hands. The routine explanation that was offered for such deaths was that the prisoner had slipped on a bar of soap while taking a shower and had hit his head on the concrete floor with fatal consequences. This explanation was offered to the public in a spirit of deep cynicism. It was meant to be understood as a coded way of saying that the prisoner had died under interrogation, and it was so understood by every reader with any savvy. No South African reader of Waiting for the Barbarians, which came out in 1980, could have failed to make a connection between the activities of Colonel Joel in the unnamed empire of which he is a servant, and the activities of the special branch in South Africa. The question staring Professor Lighton, censor, staring him in the face, was this: what was he to say in his report? Was he to say that the shameful activities described in the book had a close parallel in the shameful activities going on at that very moment in certain South African prison cells? Or was he going to say that the book had nothing to do with South Africa, that it was about the activities of torturers in a far-off country in the Northern Hemisphere, and anyhow that it was so obscurely written that it would be read by only a few people? As I've said, I have no personal knowledge of Professor Lighton, who is, I believe, deceased. But I like to think that he was a person of normal moral sensitivities, who had thought carefully before taking on a position in which it was his duty to enforce government policy. I would like to think that reading Waiting for the Barbarians caused him some heart-searching in his role as censor. We may smile when we hear that once upon a time, in a far-off country in Africa, the regime set up a costly and elaborate system to block citizens from looking at pictures of naked bodies or reading the writings of Karl Marx. At least we are better off than that, we like to tell ourselves. At least we have cast off the dreary censors and asserted our freedom to read and look at what we wish. At least